Hey, it's Nick Walters here again with yet another great deep dive on our podcast for this week in Christian history. And we are focused this week on an event that happened on March the 6th in 1858 when Father Isaac Hecker received what we lay people may call the permission to go forward and create what is known as the Paulist Fathers here in the United States. And I have with me today Father Ron Franco, who is one of the Paulist Fathers that is knows a heck of a lot more about Isaac Hecker and the Paulist Fathers than I ever certainly will know. And he is in New York. And in addition to all of that, spent some time in Knoxville, Tennessee. Is that right, Father?
Yes,
Right?
I was pastor in Knoxville, Tennessee at Immaculate Conception Church, which is the oldest Catholic church in Knoxville.
How about
I
that?
was there from 2010 to 2020.
Okay.
And the
Okay.
church there was founded in 1855. We didn't take it over until 1973, the Paulist Fathers, but it was founded in
Okay.
1855. So,
How about that? All
so
right. Well, that's
nice to
good.
be there.
You got to understand what real fried chicken was like then, right? I mean, somewhere in part of that. So, hey, but tell us, obviously, the whole story about the Paulist Fathers is centered around Isaac Hecker. Whenever we want to be able to talk about him and about his background, and so why don't you just give us an overview, if you will, of him, and then let's talk more about the Paulist Fathers.
Okay, well, that's Isaac Hecker behind me, by the way, in that stained glass window.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, so
The
that's
top.
Isaac
Okay.
Hecker. Isaac Hecker was born in 1819. He was the youngest of several children in a German-American immigrant family in New York City and what we now call the Lower East Side. His father abandoned the family at some point early on. And his two older brothers, John and George, were very successful in the bakery business, and they eventually formulated flour in a distinctive way, which became known as Hecker flour. You may have heard of that. The brand still exists. It's now owned by Pillsbury, but I believe it was sold to Pillsbury. I'm not sure when, but anyway, so John and George made lots of money, and they were very active citizens. They're very active in local politics. In fact, John remained active in New York City Democratic Party politics till the end of his life. And their mother converted to Methodism. This was the period of the Great Awakening, or the tail end of the Second Great Awakening. So it was a period really when the United States became intensely religious country. And Isaac is part of that process as a boy. He has an early sense of himself. Maybe he gets this from his mother. I don't know, of him, that God has a plan for him in his life, although he doesn't know what that is. And as many people did at that time, he tries out many different religious denominations. He looks around, sees what's going on, and he comes under the influence of Orestes Brownson, who was at that time, a Unitarian preacher and public intellectual, as we would say today, in New England. And Brownson encouraged him to go to Boston to participate at Brook Farm, which was a kind of utopian community set up by a group of Transcendentalists who were Unitarians and other New England Congregationalists on the verge of becoming something else, that transition that was going on at that time, and a rejection basically of Orthodox Calvinism in favor of various other things. And so he was part of that group for a while. He was exposed to a lot of different intellectual and religious influences. And gradually, to his own surprise, he finds himself attracted to Roman Catholicism. And eventually in 1843, both he and Orestes Brownson become Catholics the same year. And then Isaac's brother George follows him into the church. John became an Episcopalian and remained one for the rest of his life, but George became a Catholic. And Isaac joined the Catholic Church on August 1st, 1844. And so once he does this, this is kind of the solution to the first part of his problem.
Mm.
What am I supposed to do with my life? And so he discovers, he writes a diary during this period, which is very interesting in terms of how he juggles these different religious influences and cultural influences and political concerns that he starts out with. And he says, so he realizes that the Holy Spirit, as he comes to recognize, to identify, has been leading him into the Catholic Church. Now, what does he do? Well, now what does he find himself to do in this? And of course, he's attracted immediately to the priesthood. And after a year, he wants to join the Redemptorists. Now, the Redemptorists were a religious order founded by Saint Aloysius Gonzaga in the 1700s in
We
Naples.
won't hold you to it. No worry.
All right, yeah, they were founded to basically to reach out to marginalized people, on the margins of Neapolitan society who were being neglected by the institutional church. And so they founded the preaching mission. Now, you're probably familiar with what a revival movement was in the
Sure.
South. Well, parish missions were the same kind of thing in a Catholic world. So they were geared to bringing people back to the sacraments, get them to go to confession and communion and so forth. So the Redemptorists were founded to do that sort of thing. A group of them came to the United States and ministered mainly to German immigrants. So the Redemptorist province that he joined was German immigrants, serving German immigrants in the United States. So he goes to Europe. And remember, he's only been a Catholic for a year. So he's really just he's throwing himself into this experience and he's enjoying the sense of, this whole Catholic culture that he's imbibing for the first time. He's reading all these French Jesuits and Redemptorist spiritual writers and so forth. St. Alphonsus Liguori was the founder of the Redemptorists. I think I said Aloysius Gonzaga. That was an accident. He's a Jesuit. St. Alphonsus Liguori was the founder of the Redemptorists. And so, he's imbibing all this spiritual tradition. And after several years, he's eventually ordained a priest in England, in London, in 1849. And he spends some time there, doing work with the Redemptorists there in London and Liverpool. And in 1851, the decision is made to have a parish mission band in the United States that would include native-born Americans,
Right.
who could preach in English. And so Isaac Hecker is part of that group, and Clarence Walworth is also part of that group. And he becomes one of the most prominent preachers in American Catholicism at that period. So they are part of this larger group that is going around doing these parish missions in Redemptorist and other churches in the United States. They travel all over. They go around the South, as well as in the East. And gradually they also find themselves preaching to non-Catholics. And Isaac feels that this is his vocation. He feels he has been called to reach out to people like himself, people who were searchers, people who were looking for something new, who were unsatisfied with their religious experience. He felt that most people in the United States at that time, a lot of people didn't have denominational loyalties. They were just sort of generically Christian or looking for something, and that they needed to, so he was looking to reach out to them. And so there were 5 Redemptorist priests, all of whom had been converts like Isaac. So there was Isaac Hecker, there was Augustine Hewitt, there was George Deshawn, there was Francis Baker, and there, of course, was Clarence Walworth, who was the star of the group at that time. And they were all eager to get involved in this kind of work. So
Yeah,
at
you
this
mean the
point,
work of not just trying to be Redemptorist or get
right,
quote unquote Catholics back
right.
into the
In
fold,
addition
but
to
going
doing that,
outside of
to reach out to native-born Americans, English-speaking, because they were doing mainly work in German parishes, but they were spreading beyond that to English-speaking people. So, so now a dispute emerges basically with the Redemptorist leadership about, well, what is it that we're here to do? because, we need you to serve these German immigrants, and you want to do this other thing, which is maybe a good thing to do, but that's not what we're here to do. So there's this dispute going on. So finally, it's decided that Isaac will go to Rome to speak with the Redemptor superiors in Rome to get permission to do this. They want to establish an English-speaking house that will focus entirely on work with native-born English-speaking Americans, and that would reach out to non-Catholics. So he goes to Rome. Well, this is a very unsuccessful experience for him. He gets to Rome, and the Redemptorist Superior General is not impressed with him. He's one of the few people who wasn't. Hecker apparently was a very charming man, and he charmed people all his life. People all liked him, but this one case it didn't work. And so he gets there, and he's dismissed from the order on the grounds that he had come to Rome without permission, because you needed permission to travel. You couldn't just show up and say, I want to do something. You had to get permission to go. And also that he'd used his brother's money in violation of his vow of poverty.
Okay.
So he was dismissed, and he was quite irate about this, as you might imagine, very, very disconsolate. But he was convinced that he had this calling from God to do this. So he appealed. Now, Isaac was well known in the United States. In the 1850s, as a Redemptorist priest, he had written 2 books. The first was called Questions of the Soul. The second was called Aspirations of Nature. And they both were basically, the first was more semi-autobiographical. It was, again, reaching out to searchers, seekers, such as he himself had been, with a kind of new kind of apologetics, an argument for the faith that was not based on historical quarrels with the Reformation and those kinds of things, which he felt didn't interest people and were not convincing to people, but rather appealing to their basic that human nature is called by God to relationship with God, and that the fulfillment of that is going to be in the Catholic Church. And this is very counterintuitive to most Americans at the time. So he really has to make his case, and he uses his own story, his own experience to do that. So he believes that the basic questions of the soul and the aspirations of human nature are going to be fulfilled in the Catholic Church, and that's what he lays out. So he becomes quite well known. In fact, he was considered as one of the 3 finalists for the post of Bishop of Natchez, Mississippi, which is now the Diocese of Jackson. He doesn't get that job. Obviously, it goes to someone named Elder. I think it's William Elder, who gets into a lot of trouble with the Union Army during the Civil War. So it was just well that Hecker didn't get that job. But that means that he's known in Rome. So that when he appeals to Cardinal Barnabo, who is the head of the Congregation of Propaganda Fide, which is the congregation that's in charge of missionary work.
Okay.
And therefore interested in the United States. And Barnabo is very interested in evangelizing the United States. Well, he already knows who Hecker is, because, I mean, this was a candidate for bishop. So he's receptive to Hecker's case. And so Hecker appeals, and this goes on for several months. He spends his time in Rome writing. He writes some articles. And he tries to make his case that the United States, this is again counterintuitive to everybody, that the United States is just ripe for evangelization, that it's just ready to become a Catholic country, which is, nobody thinks this is the case, but they're semi-convinced by him. He's very successful in making his case. There's a famous audience that he has with Pope Pius IX in December of 1857, and Pius points out that the Americans are factionalized. They're quarreling with each other. He says these different political groups, they get each other by the hair, and Hecker says, yes, but the Catholic Church, the Catholic faith will be like oil on troubled waters, and it will calm everything. So that's his vision. That's what he believes. And so finally, on March 6th, the decree was issued, which adjudicated this. Now, what had happened in the meantime, when the other 4 had found out that Hecker had been expelled, they had applied for a dispensation from their vows, that is, for permission to leave the Redemptorists. And so what the Pope did, he attached Hecker to the petition of those 4 and granted all 5 of them dispensation together. So in effect, without saying so, he nullified what the Redemptorist Superior had done. He nullified the expulsion by granting Hecker a dispensation. So this was a nice Roman way of solving it, and everybody's face was saved. Everybody was happy with the solution. In fact,
that took place then, right on. That's kind of what we are noting in our podcast for this episode, is that dispensation that took place on March 6th, right?
March 6th,
That's part of that.
1858.
So,
and in fact, the Redemptorist Superior had suggested that. He said, well, they could go back to America and work under the local bishop. They don't have to be Redemptorists anymore. That would solve the problem. So that's what they decide to do. So they come back. Oh, Hecker comes back. The others are still here. And he comes to New York, where his brother George has a house. And they meet together, and they eventually, by July, come up with a plan for what will become the Missionary Society of St. Paul the Apostle, which is the first congregation or religious order of American priests founded in the United States.
How about that? Hey, we are enjoying our great visit here that we're having with Father Ron Franco, who is giving us some really great information about a number of things, primarily about the Paulist Fathers, and particularly about Father Isaac Hecker. So this is very interesting. So saying that again, this is the first time of what we might just call a total American order. Is that right? Is it
all these were Americans? They were all, in fact, they were all converts. Now, unlike Hecker, the other four had all come through the Oxford movement. The Oxford movement, of course, which was in England. St. John Newman is the most famous example of that. These were Church of England Anglicans and Episcopalians in the United States who were more and more attracted to the church fathers and to the historical roots of the Anglican Church, and many of them, that led them to return to reunion with the Roman Church. So the separation that occurred in the 16th century, which is, is a whole other political story in English history. So these people had come out of that Episcopalian tradition. So they had a different experience from Hecker, which is important because Hecker was convinced. I mean, his model of American Protestantism, of course, was New England congregationalism turning into Unitarianism, turning into whatever. And so he was convinced that that was on its way out, and that Catholicism would be what would replace it. Whereas the others had a more nuanced understanding of American Protestantism and weren't so convinced that, that everybody was just going to adopt Catholicism, which of course they didn't. So they were right on that score. But Hecker was convinced that Hecker was convinced, contrary to most people's view, that American democracy and Roman Catholicism were really quite compatible. This was counterintuitive to many people. But now Alexis de Tocqueville, of course, the famous French aristocrat who studied American democracy in the 1830s, had come to a similar conclusion. I mean, not in theological terms, but he said, look at this, all these Catholics here, and they're very devoted to the American Republic. They are perfectly at home in this, and it's working fine for them. And in fact, freedom of the separation of church and state and freedom is actually helping the Catholic Church to grow in the United States. So, I mean, it's not an unheard of idea, but framed in theological terms, as Hecker did, this was kind of a new idea. And it was surprising to a lot of people. And in fact, they didn't make a lot of converts. And in fact, the growth of the church in the United States would be mainly through immigration then as now, but certainly in the 19th century was all these immigrants coming over, first from Ireland and Germany, and then later from Italy and Poland and all sorts of other places. But they did try, and they did focus on this mission that Hecker had, which was to reach out to people who were seeking. So as part of the deal, Archbishop Hughes said, if you want to you can do what you want to do, but you also have to run a parish in New York, because I have all these people that have to be served. So he gave them this new parish he created on the west side of Manhattan near Columbus Circle, St. Paul the Apostle Parish, which is still here. They built a small little church. Now we have a big, huge church that was dedicated in 1885. And so he was the first pastor of the parish, as well as the head of the community. But they also did parish missions to the extent that they were able. They also, Hecker's not he was not mainly a preacher, he was more of a lecturer, and he would give these public lectures. This was very fashionable in the 19th century. People didn't have TV or movies or any of those things. They would go out to talks and lectures, public lectures. And he would go from town to town and give lectures on why he became a Catholic, why Catholicism is good for you, why you should go to confession, all these kinds of things. And also they founded a magazine, The Catholic World, which was meant to be the kind of the intellectual voice of American Catholicism for American-born people who were interested in religious questions. So they did all these things and were quite successful at a lot of what they did, you know, in terms of the magazine, in terms of parish missions. Now, of course, the Civil War came and that limited their activity for a while. Clarence Walworth, the fifth member of the group, didn't join because he felt that he felt that they were going too far away from their original Redemptorist roots, and so he decided to become a diocesan priest in Albany. But he remained very friendly with the Paulist Fathers and very supportive of their work. Francis Baker died in 1865, so very early on they lost one of them. So the other two founders lasted until the turn of the century, and a few, you know, and of course new members joined the community, but it was a very small community, and they were, you know, they were running a parish, running a magazine, you know, publishing pamphlets, trying to conduct missions in parishes, doing public lectures, trying to do all these things on a relatively small group of people, and they were quite successful in those terms for that time. Hecker himself, in 1869, goes to Europe for the First Vatican Council. He's not a bishop, so he's not a participant in the council, but he goes as the assistant to one of the bishops, so he's able to find out what's going on and, you know, get involved in all the, you know. He wasn't very happy with it because there was a very unhappy atmosphere at that time. There's a lot of conflict in Europe. This is just the eve of the Franco-Prussian War. It's
Sure.
the eve of the unification of Italy, which is going to end the council. The council is going to be suspended because of that. So there's a lot of stress going on. But he comes back, again, confident that this is a good era for the church. You know, this is a good time to do this work for the church. And then what happens is he begins to become ill. So in the 1870s, his energy diminishes. He becomes increasingly ill. And then he does what rich people in the 19th century did, because he wasn't rich, but his brother was. He travels for his health. So he goes back to Europe, he travels around, goes to, you know, I guess to spas and things like that.
Right.
Goes to the Holy Land. He makes a pilgrimage there. He goes to Egypt. And he has some very interesting experiences. For instance, he's very impressed when he sees the way Muslims pray. He says, wow, would that we did that. You know, would that Christians had the fervor that some of these Muslims have. So his vision becomes broader. You know, he's been primarily focused on the United States, but now he's more focused on the world. And he thinks, well, we could have Paulist Fathers in London and Paris and all these places. Of course, none of that happens because, of course, there are only a few of them, but they don't have a lot of resources. But he's dreaming of all these things. Then as his health deteriorates further, of course, he comes home and he remains active writing. He's writing articles to the year he dies. And his last book is published the year before he dies, which is basically a collection of articles that he'd written earlier. So he is still intellectually active almost until the end, but physically he's limited. He doesn't give public lectures anymore and that kind of thing. Until he dies in December 22nd, 1888. So then, of course, the Paulist Fathers continue, you know,
Yes.
under the leadership of Father Hewitt. And then after him, Father Deschamps takes over. And then, of course, the founding generation is gone and new generations will move in. And the Paulists become very active, especially in the 20th century. Again, they're doing parish missions. They also become active in campus ministry. which again is this kind of setting of being in secular universities where they uh, witness to the faith in those settings, and of course
Sure.
publication. So their early pamphlet publishing becomes the Paulist Press, which is still very active today in today's church in the United States.
That seems like a good interaction right on the college campus, because you would think there might be percentage-wise or ratio-wise more seekers, right? Maybe earlier in your life, you're trying to kind of figure this out. Maybe you came from whatever backgrounds you came for, and now you're in more of this kind of a melting pot of other people that you may not have had that opportunity to have dialogue. And so if there's someone there that can say, yes, let me tell you the story of one of our seekers, right? And
And
how
that's
he
exactly
came
what
to
he
that,
was
right?
doing. He would tell his story, and he saw his story as a model
Mm,
for the American, you know, person who'd grown up in the United States, was filled with democratic values, wasn't looking for a European style religious experience, but nonetheless, this very foreign seeming church, what seemed very foreign to many Americans, he felt fit perfectly, and his job was to show people how that fit worked.
yeah. How about that? Wow. So so tell me, kind of today anyway, where is the presence of the Paulist Fathers throughout various parishes throughout the U.S.?
Well, of course, as is the case, with so many today, our numbers are fewer again. We had our peak uh, in the post-war period. There was a period of there were probably about 250 Paulists at one point, which is still relatively small, but was quite large compared to the original. Now we're much smaller. We're less than 100. So we have our parish here in New York. We have a parish in Chicago, downtown Chicago. We have a parish in Austin, Texas. We have a parish in Los Angeles. And we also have the UCLA, the campus ministry at the UCLA campus, which is kind of next to that parish. So those are big operations there. We also have a parish in San Francisco, the original cathedral in San Francisco.
Huh. Yeah.
And then, of course, Knoxville, Tennessee, where I was. So we had in Knoxville, we had the little downtown parish, which I was a pastor of. We also had the campus ministry at the University of Tennessee, which is located in Knoxville. So there were 4 of us working there, 2 at the parish, 2 at the campus, and we lived together in one house and had our religious community life together. So we're spread now. We're not spread as widely as we once were. There was a period when we had a parish in Toronto. We had a campus ministry at McGill University in Montreal, but we had to withdraw from those because of our staffing needs. We also staff the American Church in Rome, which is the Church of St. Patrick in Rome. And we've been in Rome since 1922. Originally, we were at the Church of Santa Susana, then we had to move to St. Patrick's. So we serve the American community, such as it is in Rome. We're located right near the American Embassy. We also provide service for the Marymount International School, which is an English-speaking school in children in Rome. And we also, of course, one of the priests there is also the representative to the Holy See for dealing with things that have to be done of that sort. So that's kind of where we're spread around right now.
Yeah. So that gives you a
Oh, and I just mentioned we have a new parish we just took recently in San Diego.
Oh, okay.
Big, huge suburban parish.
Okay.
Lots of families. Yeah.
All right. So just from my ignorance, let's just say I lived in Omaha and there wasn't a parish there of the Paulist Fathers there. How does that get created? How does somebody do I, as a good a member of my local parish, have read up and heard about what's happening here, or is it more of like?
Well, you might, if you're the sort of person who's interested, you might have read some Paulist Press books, for example.
Yeah.
So you might know about the Paulists that way. Or we also have Paulist Productions, which used to make it at one point. It made a TV series called Insight, which was very popular back in the days, when networks had to give a certain amount of time for public service.
Right.
So
Right.
religious programming was very easy to do at that time. Now with that, you don't do that anymore. But we make some feature films now. So we made a film on Dorothy Day, who was the founder of the Catholic Worker, who's also up for sainthood. We made a film on Oscar Romero, uh,
Right.
who is now a saint, and that was a very successful film. And they're doing other projects. I don't know what other project. Oh, yes, they've just finished a project on Catholic chaplains.
Huh.
A very interesting film on military chaplains and the history of and some of the interesting figures who've been chaplains over the years. So these are available, and of course you might see those. That might be shown in your parish, for instance, or some group you're connected with. So you might find out about the Paulists that way. Most of the young people who come to us as seminarians, they encounter the Paulists online mainly. We have a young adult ministry. We have a young adult ministry called Busted Halo, and it has and they have a radio show, which is
Yes.
4 days a week. And so a lot of people, they have listened to the radio show, or they've been to the website, or, and there are podcasts for young people and so forth.
Right.
So
And
that's
YouTube videos. I actually use one in my class, as a
there
matter
you
of
go.
fact,
Okay.
on Saint Augustine. I
There
actually
you go. Okay. So that kind of outreach is what a lot of young people today will encounter. And that's
Mhm.
how they'll hear about the Paulists and might apply to join the Paulist Fathers, for example. Our seminaries in Washington, D.C., at Hecker House, as it's called, which is we used to have a very big, huge building near Catholic University called St. Paul's College. Now we have a much smaller building. It's in the same location, more or less, but it's just walking distance from Catholic University, which is where they take their theology courses. So that's our community in Washington.
How about that? Well, this has been really, really interesting to know about this, and to know, I'm sure there will be people who might not be as familiar, who will certainly know a heck of a lot more than they did when they started, right?
Well, thank you for the opportunity. I'm sure Hecker would appreciate the chance to talk. Because they didn't have podcasts in his day, but he would have loved
No
it.
podcast,
He would have loved it if he could have.
but exploring ideas and learning more about it, that seems right up his alley, right? I mean,
Right.
to be able to discuss all of that. Well, we have enjoyed our conversation with Father Ron Franco today on our This Week in Christian History. If you would like to know more about the Paulist Fathers, Father, what's the best website, or what's a spot where they could go learn more about the Paulist Fathers?
Well, the Paulist Fathers have a website.
We'll put it in the show notes. We'll put it
Yeah,
in the notes on there.
I don't know the exact address, but if you just put in Paulist Fathers, it'll come up.
You're going to find
Yeah.
you. Right, right.
And
That's
so we have a very good website which talks about Hecker and shows all sorts of stuff about the kinds of things we're doing right now, and also, and of course, Busted Halo, that has its own website, and that is a great resource for all sorts of people who are still spiritually seeking, all
yes.
kinds of outreach to all kinds of people is found on that website.
Fantastic, fantastic. And of course, there's always more about what we're doing at the Center for Christian History, which you can find at centerforchristianhistory.com. So, Father, thank you for your time.
You're very welcome. Enjoyed it very much.